there hasn't been enough discussion in this quantitative literature because quality of social interactions is so hard to measure. There hasn't been enough work in this field of when do we have a quality interaction. So if you have a great friend, do you really need to see this guy 365 days a year or just 4 days a year? Sort of similar issue in terms of productivity, learning, and mentoring. And we need much more work on that to better understand if more mothers do work from home, will this become a pink ghetto or will it become this utopia that Matt keeps chanting about?
Hi, I'm Rob Sadow, and you're listening to the Flex Perspectives podcast, where we interview the world's best thinkers, researchers, and operators on how to make flexible work work. Flex Perspectives is brought to you by FlexIndex, the leading global insight platform for flexible work. FlexIndex covers flexible work strategies for more than 10,000 companies across 75,000 office locations and 100 million people. Today, my guest is Professor Matthew Kahn. Professor Kahn is the Provost Professor of Economics at the University of Southern California and has researched remote work extensively. In this episode, Matthew talks about the imperative for cities to rethink their strategies in the face of remote work. We talk about the implication of remote work for the labor force participation of working mothers, and even how local politics influence hybrid work policies. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us out by subscribing and giving us a rating. It helps us understand what episodes our listeners find most valuable and helps new listeners find the podcast.
This episode of Flex Perspectives is brought to you by Office Benchmarks. In today's hybrid world, workplace executives face critical lease and space allocation decisions. Make the wrong move and it could cost millions, impact productivity, and hurt retention. You need reliable data, not news headlines. That's why companies like TD Bank, Southwest, and Chime rely on Office Benchmarks. Office Benchmarks is the only solution that combines flexible work policy and office usage metrics to help workplace leaders compare their footprint, space design, and usage to peers with similar policies. Get started today at flexindex.com.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here.
So Matt, you did, I don't know if you remember this, but you did one of the very first pieces of analysis using FlexIndex data. Do you recall what that analysis was?
Yes, I just reread it and I give myself a B+, but I liked it.
Well, I'm just talking a little bit about it because I think it is a particularly interesting piece of work, especially in the middle of 2024, given what is happening in the world right now.
Rob, thank you. So I'm an economist, and three types of economists are looking at work from home data. And I love what Flex has created. There's labor economists, environmental economists, and urban economists. And what I was up to in my study is I took a look at the geography of in what sorts of geographic areas are firms more likely to be in the office versus hybrid or fully remote. And what I documented was the following. In metropolitan areas with higher home prices, firms are more likely to not be in the office full time. And my story there is to improve worker quality of life. If you only have to go to the office 2 or 3 days a week, you can improve the quality of life of workers, attract them and retain them if firms are partially remote. Rob, did you buy that argument? So the correlation was there, and I was hoping to start a literature, but I'm not generating many sites so far.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the couple of things that we've looked at, and since then we've gathered a lot more scale of data. So now we have data on, I think, more than 10,000 companies. So we have a much richer policy data set. Cost of living, to your point, ends up being one of the biggest correlates that we find with likelihood of a firm in a given metro to offer flexible work. And I think it's some combination of commuting is more expensive. If home prices are more expensive, you're more likely to live further away from work. And as a result, like that makes it a little bit more painful to come in, going in and parking and food. So your thesis, I think, holds, right? And I think it's a broader issue with like when it's expensive, people don't want to go to the office as much.
And Rob, the second part of my study, especially as we head into an election in 2024, may be a little more controversial. I tested the hypothesis and found evidence for the following. In our red state, blue state, purple state nation, in all else equal, when a firm is located in a blue state, voting for Joe Biden in 2020, firms are more likely to allow for hybrid and fully remote work. And I want to tell two different stories there and ask for your opinion. One story from urban economics is that classic cities like New York City, Boston, San Francisco are monocentric cities where suburbanites have long public transit train rides, like my father from Scarsdale to New York City. And in such a setting where if home prices are high and if there's long commutes to jobs in the city center, the firm trying to be fair to its workers will be even more likely to allow for remote work. And this comes back to what you were saying. Perhaps a more controversial explanation for my correlation. And again, the correlation is in blue states, we're seeing more remote and hybrid work. Are the bosses of these firms more open-minded to different work arrangements? Rob, how do you, and of course, with a correlation study like mine, you can't settle this. So I have fun and I generate a lot of sites for documenting something, but I don't know why my fact is a fact.
It's a great question. I will tell you, to kind of expand on the analysis that you did, that we have looked within the same industry. So trying to normalize for industry, do you see a difference in work from home rates in different parts of the country? And it holds true in the same way, right? Like if you look at the same set of metros and I look at financial services firms in those metros versus, red state metros versus blue state metros, we see a similar type of thing. I do think some of it, without passing any judgment one way or the other, some of it is just local culture. Culture is different and the way people think about the office. And in some ways, unfortunately, this topic has become a little bit of a political topic, especially with federal workers. And this has come up recently in terms of kind of like return to office and what that looks like. But I do think that correlation has continued to hold. I'm curious, do you think it will continue? If you were to rerun that analysis after the 2024 election, do you think we'll see similar things? Do you think it would be different?
I love your question. I want to tell a quick nerdy story. 25 years ago, Ed Glazer and I wrote a paper on the benefits of suburban sprawl. This paper was not loved. And we documented that most Americans, especially Americans living in new cities like Dallas, Las Vegas, and Phoenix, they live and work in the suburbs. So, Rob, when people live and work in the suburbs, they own a couple of cars and they can drive at high speeds. Those families gain less from the ability to work from home because they can get to the office so quick. So if we argue as an urban economist that much of the gains from working from home are based on savings on commuting, it will be in the old progressive cities, Boston, San Francisco, and New York. So that was a long-winded way of saying, I think the correlation I documented, that blue states have more work from home, that will persist post this exciting election.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it in the way that you just described before. So I want to take a step back, and we're going to talk a lot about work from home and different impacts on different groups, not just geography. But before we do that, can you talk a little bit about you and what you do as a professor and how you got into that? I'm curious if you give me a little bit of your personal story in terms of like how you've arrived at focusing on these topics.
So, Rob, when I was young, I'm very close with my mother, who is a lawyer. And she said, Matthew, you're so well trained in economics. During this time, this was the 1970s and 1980s, cities like Pittsburgh were deindustrializing. And my mother said to me, Matthew, what are you doing to bring manufacturing jobs back to America? And I said, Mom, I'm just watching video games and doing my homework. I'm not doing much. But then I started to write the following contrarian paper. I wrote a paper called The Silver Lining of Rust Belt Decline, where I argued that, of course, the middle class have suffered from deindustrialization. But a benefit of deindustrialization has been cleaner air and cleaner water, and a city such as Pittsburgh has become a much better quality of life city. And so, Rob, this was a long-winded way of saying that what my life's work is about the causes and consequences of great quality of life in cities. And during a time when we're talking about the urban doom loop, those cities that can deliver great quality of life, and of course this is related to clean air, good schools, street safety, good transport, clean streets, those cities that can deliver great quality of life have a bright future. And so I've been very interested going forward in how work from home creates new possibilities. So a theme there. Cities do face the loss of commercial real estate tax revenue. Great work has been done on work from home contributing to the urban doom loop. I've argued as an eternal optimist that cities will have to consider new public policies to improve quality of life to retain the footloose work from home workforce to live there. And so I'm a fan of competition and always working on urban and environmental themes. And that's how I got interested in the work from home revolution.
Something you just said I find really interesting, which is the need for cities to evolve in the face of competition and flexible work in the untethering, if you will, of work in place. At the same time, a number of cities have really struggled with quality of life from receding of traffic from downtown, right? In terms of not just commercial real estate value, but what does that do to the ability for local government to invest in that area, safety in those locations, ability for retailers to be successful. And so, it's a little bit of an interesting conundrum in my mind in terms of the same things that may make a city more competitive to talent are also some of the things that are creating some near-term challenge. I'm curious how you think about those two things in concert.
That was brilliantly put. Before interest rates went up, I was blogging my brains out saying that such cities need to issue municipal bonds to cover these short-run transition costs. So, Rob, an example of what you said. In New York City and San Francisco, both mayors, like Eric Adams in New York, are introducing incentives to encourage owners of commercial real estate to convert it into residential housing. But there's a question of how he finances that. He's not going to be able to cut the pay of the police. If these cities could cheaply issue municipal bonds, that would have been a local public finance way to smooth the transition. But as interest rates go up, your point becomes even more important.
And so in this high interest rate environment, and look, no one can prognosticate exactly the future. I think many people are hopeful that maybe we are, on the front end of slowly starting to come out of that environment. But other strategies you've seen work for cities or pieces of research you've done that have informed different ways of potentially kind of like solving some of those issues?
So, a conjecture. I am delighted that the murder rate is falling in Baltimore, Maryland, a city I lived in for 2 years. I actually met with the mayor of Baltimore, Brandon Scott, and he agreed with me on a Zoom call that it would be fine with him if the city of Baltimore became effectively a suburb of Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., that in an age of power couples, two working spouses, they could live in Baltimore and one could work in Philadelphia, sometimes hybrid, and the other in DC. So, Rob, I'd point to the Amtrak corridor as an example of the murder rate is falling in our cities. And I think that this reestablishment of street safety is a strategy to attract and retain footloose workers because Baltimore's so close to Washington, D.C. Why can't it enjoy the similar magic that D.C. has enjoyed during its recent rejuvenation?
It really requires a rethink of like the strategy and vision for a city. To use a couple examples, Baltimore and the set of choices that you just described around Baltimore are incredibly different than San Francisco, where San Francisco is thinking about, okay, well, what does the future of the city look like, especially downtown in a world where you've got a really high concentration of small and medium tech companies that are tending to be very flexible with nature. And so it's changing the composition of the way you have to think about the future of the city from a New York, for example. And so it's a fascinating era, the way that you describe it in terms of the way cities are having to rethink not just financing shortfalls in the next year or two, but what is the 10, 20, 50-year plan of the city look like in the face of some of these evolutions?
So, Rob, I love where you're going. A bit of a zigzag, but on point. Amazon hired all these economists to make it an even more successful company. And what these men and women did was they ran A/B testing to see what works. How much are people willing to pay for Amazon Prime? In my free market urbanism work, I've argued that the public sector and the Bloomberg Philanthropies is trying to do some of this to encourage mayors to experiment more. When we know that we don't know, when we know we have a problem, but we know that we don't know the solution, we need to experiment more and learn from these experiences. For example, New York City was afraid to roll out road pricing to see what it actually does. Rob, did you know that Stockholm had road pricing for a year, allowed the voters to see how it did, and then voted to keep it permanent? So I want to see more of that as cities try to adapt with the work from home challenge. The work from home challenge for cities could be an opportunity if they learn faster about how to improve quality of life at a relatively low tax price.
It's such an interesting model in that government, I feel like, typically is not used to, hey, we're going to try something and it may not work, but like, let's all get on board with trying it. I feel like government typically feels like they have to come across as, I know the answer, and therefore I'm going to go kind of like push people toward the answer. That idea of
got
like, hey,
it.
we'll try it for a year and maybe we won't do it anymore, I feel like is fairly uncommon maybe in the US, like to
You've
actually think
got it.
about it that way.
And so what I've argued there is, if I can say something politically incorrect, we have all these progressive mayors who are very conservative. I think you get my joke. If we had more competitive elections in America's big cities, if Republicans or some other party could win. So, Rob, I know we don't want to go here, but if we had more competitive elections in cities, would we get more experimentation? And would we more quickly adapt to the challenge posed from work from home, which I think could be an opportunity for improving inner city quality of life?
I mean, it certainly has been the model in corporations over time within free markets, right? And how competition breeds creativity and experimentation.
Well said.
To segue out of what you're describing, I want to talk about a particularly important block of voters or constituents to think about, which is women and mothers. And I think the work that you've done on this topic, especially the last couple of years, is really fascinating and want to spend some time on it. I know you just wrote a paper with Emma Harrington on the motherhood penalty. I was hoping maybe you could tell me a little bit about what is the motherhood penalty and what made you think about or become interested in and spending a little bit of time researching this topic.
Rob, thank you. And this is work in progress, and I've learned so much from Emma, and she's an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. And I want to talk about her nuanced work on work from home in a moment. The motherhood penalty. In the United States and around the world, when people become mothers, and this is not true for fathers, their labor force participation rate falls sharply, and in some cases can be permanent. So literally, the motherhood penalty, that doesn't mean that the parent now is sad that they're a parent. This is that there's no free lunch and that the labor force participation of people who become mothers declines. Rob, on this quick podcast, you've learned that I'm an eternal optimist. Linking into my eternal optimism about everything in life. And my mother says to me, Matthew, no magical thinking. But the magical thinking in this women's project is when firms allow for work from home and hybrid work from home, that this allows mothers, often who are juggling many balls of the chore wars at home, taking care of older parents, taking care of the new child, it allows them to juggle work along with these other responsibilities. So, Rob, a piece of fun mathematics. Suppose that Matthew is a new mother and I need to work 8 hours a day for my firm. If there's 24 hours of the day and I need to work 8 of them for the firm, I used to work from 9 to 5, like in that Dolly Parton movie. But if I can choose my 8 hours during the day, there's 720 permutations. And so I know you're a good mathematician. Do you see all that flexibility baked in? And so my starting point of my work with Emma was our ongoing discussions of, and our documentation using great evidence that we're still working out. When women have the flexibility to work from home a few days a week or permanently, because they've majored in subjects that are amenable to working from home, like working with a computer, there's less of a motherhood penalty. Rob, do you grade that as a B+? That was actually pretty well explained.
Yeah, it's a great summary. I think what I'm curious to understand, and the hypothesis and the thesis around it makes sense. How did you test it? Like, how did you go about it? What was some of the data you put together? Like, take me through the process a little bit.
So, Rob, as you've learned, I'm an endless enthusiast. And Emma, so the story, every research team has a genesis. Emma Harrington is becoming one of the nation's leaders on thinking about work from home and its implications for men and women. In her work independent of me, she's done work on the costs of working from home, of female engineers being out of the loop, of not being able to ask senior researchers at the firm coding questions. And this is fascinating work. Rob, my work with Emma has focused on the benefits, potential benefits for working from home, the flexibility benefits of juggling multiple balls. So to give a cliche example, the example to prepare for dinner while on a Zoom meeting, of all these economies of scope. Now to answer your question, Emma convinced me that I was wrong. And Rob, as you can imagine, I'm like a baseball player. I want to hit 300. So out of every 10 of my crazy ideas, maybe 3 are right.
And then you go to the Hall of Fame. It works. Then.
Yes. In basketball, I'd be like Shaquille O'Neal shooting free throws. But where Emma showed me I was wrong was the following. I conjectured that a silver lining of the COVID shock of 2020, just as there was a silver lining of Pittsburgh steel decline, a silver lining of COVID was we learned that firms can be productive with work from home, and at that time and going forward, firms will let more workers work from home. Emma said, yes, Matt, but calm down. She documented using some great data that we've seen a rise in working from home for the last 20 years. And this is due to the rise of computers, the rise of internet technology like Zoom and internet cable. So there have been a whole set of investments that were accelerated by COVID. And Rob, to take 10 more seconds, in the data sets Emma was able to access, we know what a young woman majored in college. And so if she majors in nursing, that's a field which is hands-on. You can't be remote. You can't be a nurse from home. But if you majored in computer science, and there's subjects which if you major in them, you have a greater probability of being able to do your job from home. And we find a smaller motherhood penalty for college graduate females who majored in those subjects.
So how do you square a couple of things? I'm curious to understand. We're in a economic environment where unemployment has been what feels like structurally tight for a while now, right? Sub 4% unemployment. You've got a population that historically was participating at lower rates that, looking at recent data, I think women age, I think 35 to 54, 18 to 54, whatever it might be in the US, participating at all-time highs. And so to your point, you're finding that enabling some level of work from home allows for greater participation in the workforce. Yet you have a lot of companies that have pushed back against this, in terms of what that means, even though the labor market is tight and there are a set of pressures that they're trying to face as a company in an uncertain macro environment. And so do you think that that topic is poorly understood, or people don't believe the data? It's less important to a CEO than culture or other things around operating? Like, I'm curious what your thesis is on why isn't this changing attitudes and behaviors more quickly at the C-level?
This is an excellent question. And I'm going to give a nerd's answer. I would love to ask the CEO of different firms the same question. Rob, what Emma and I have wrestled with is who are the women who are now working? So 3 different stories. Is it the case that there was a woman who would have been out of the labor force completely and then had a child who now is working? Are there women who are working part-time and now work full-time because they can work from home? And are there women who had a job? They were rising at some law firm in an up or out setting, and now with work from home, they are more likely to become a partner because they don't exit with this up or out. That a cliche that I believe is that too many women who attended great law schools, at some point, the up or out in our pre-work from home economy led them to permanently opt out of the workforce. And my mother has emphasized to me that a weakness in my beloved capitalism is that too many 50-year-old women who got a great education but then dropped out to raise kids have not been reintegrated into the economy. And so in my endless optimism, I claim that the rise of work from home can lead to less severe forks in the road. But to answer your question, it's a great question, but I actually don't know the answer.
Are there other things structurally that you think need to change to further allow some of those benefits to be accrued? Examples of things I think about are childcare and school hours and things like that also create challenges around whether working in the office or kind of like working 9 to 5, if you will, broadly.
Yes. So what you're right about is there's random events, for example, a sick child, a child having a hockey game and you want to attend. There's events that can be anticipated that a kid's going to get sick in winter, but you don't know on which days. If there are jobs, Rob, give me an extra chance. I understand that if you and I run a hedge fund, we need to get this trade done in the next 8 seconds. But if you and I are writing the New York Times Sunday magazine, I think we have till Saturday night to finalize the issue. And so I'm cracking a half joke, but I hope I'm making a smart point. For those jobs where there isn't an urgency of now to get it done in the next hour, if it isn't first through the tape, in those sort of relay race settings where there's a lot of flexibility if Rob works the third shift or the fourth shift of how we get the product done, I think we're going to see much more flexibility in our economy. So to try one more time, the answer to your question crucially depends on production. Is it all hands on deck? In that case, work from home isn't going to add much. Or is it editing a Google Doc where if Sally's really good at thinking of witty alliteration or writing the New York Post headline, then we can bring her in at the end to do her thing on her own schedule.
You know, Matt, it strikes me that maybe one of the issues is differences in perceptions of relative urgency within a company. I think that I've been a CEO for 10 years now, right? And I think about from a CEO perspective or an executive perspective, we tend to have a bad habit of wanting everything done urgently, right? Like we want everything quickly, and relative tolerance for more time is probably not a common characteristic amongst executives, right? But to your point, there's a lot of work that doesn't need to be done immediately and probably shouldn't be done immediately. And there are different learning patterns and working styles that actually may get a worse output if you rush to get it done versus taking more time and doing it at the right time that's ready for you. And so I wonder if part of it is comfort with the idea of allowing topics or tasks to take time that maybe just felt differently at different levels within a company.
I like your point. And to build on your point, I want to take us to two places. First, if a firm like your firm gets a reputation for having a sane boss, and Rob, take that as a compliment, you're going to be able to attract more talent at a lower pay and be more likely to retain them. So in my optimism about competition, those firms and bosses that earn a reputation for understanding work-life balance will actually be rewarded for this. Almost like that old cliche, does Ben and Jerry's really care about the environment, or do they know they could sell more ice cream to hipsters by appearing to care? That was a half joke. The second point I want to make is about work from home as an experience good. My father, I love my father. He retired. He was a famous doctor, and it shocked him that he could do medical consultations with patients without physically touching them. It never occurred to him, because every doctor is sort of a CEO of his or her own little firm. It never occurred to him before COVID that you could examine a patient over Zoom, and he actually learned to like it. And so this experience good point, where famous experience goods are like, I didn't know until I saw the first Star Wars movie, Star Wars 4 in 1977, of how much I would love those movies. Do some of these CEOs need to be nudged to experiment? So, Rob, at your firm, have there been workplace experiments, or you've optimized at step one?
No, of course you can. I think the optimization is actually in the experimentation, to borrow from a point that you made earlier, right? Like I think being experimental is actually part of the optimization in and of itself, right? It maybe defined in the opposite is avoiding complacency and belief that you've got the answer is actually a critical part of a high performance culture in my mind. And so it's been part of how we've thought about it for as long as I can remember.
And I would say that competition, if a CEO, and we're not talking about you, happens to be complacent, competition will be the kick in the tuchus.
That's exactly right. So from the research that you've done, and you've looked at this topic now from a bunch of different angles, and we talked about it from a motherhood penalty and kind of like women participation perspective, what are some of the key takeaways? And if you think about different audiences, whether maybe you're a working mother, whether you're a partner to a working mother, whether you're a corporation or a city, are there kind of like concrete things that people should be thinking about or doing differently based on some of the research you've done here?
Yes. Rob, I had a very interesting discussion with a sociologist about my book, Going Remote, and we've talked about several of the themes of the book. I've sneaked them in. And she said, Matt, I congratulate you on your book, but your book is elitist. And I said, why? And she said, Matt, not all workers are eligible for the work from home workforce. A dentist can't do it. A machinery guy can't do it. And I said, you're absolutely right. But every year we graduate new graduates from high school and college. And now that they anticipate that work from home for the set of firms that Flex Index identifies as allowing for hybrid and remote work, that you can work at these firms while being a remote worker, young people will position their investments in themselves. They'll make fewer TikTok videos of themselves and dance around less in sexy clothing and actually make the investments in their skills to be ready, to be eligible to be in such a privileged position. Rob, how do you grade that? The sociologist kind of gave me a puzzled look with their zero-sum game mentality, but I'm a good debater, and when I've had a couple of cups of coffee, I can't be stopped.
I think you might get some pushback from folks around TikTok who say, "Hey, look, I'm making a livelihood on TikTok." But I think maybe to like add to your point, because I think there's wisdom in what you're describing. Like that, there are two things in my mind. One, we shouldn't pretend that work from home is the very first job benefit or compensation element that somehow differs between types of jobs in the workforce. We see it within different functions at the same company, at different levels of seniority in the same company, at different offices around the world in the same company. And so we have specialized the way we think about compensation and benefits and work experience for jobs forever, right? We've been on a steady journey in that direction over time. And so I think fairness is a bit of a kind of like the wrong way to maybe frame this versus like, hey, look, we should be trying to create the best experience, the best employee value proposition for every type of role. And that might be a different chemistry for one type of role than a different one. The other is, and in conversations, Nick Bloom, who I work with a lot, talks about this regularly, is there are ways of applying flexibility in non-obvious fashions to jobs that still require to be full-time on site, right? And that's the difference between, do all of your shifts have to look the same, or do you allow optionality to pick 4 days at 10 hours instead of 5 days at 8 hours? I know at Stanford, for example, they've been playing with, the faculty really need to be there over the summer, or if they're not teaching, is that actually a period to enable more flexibility around location in that regard? And so I think sometimes the constraint is actually in the creativity of the manager in thinking about this versus empirically, there's one role where you can apply this topic and there's another role where it just doesn't apply at all.
Agreed. And I've learned so much from Nick. So a great thing that's going on in work from home economics is both the data you're creating and the data Nick Bloom, Steve Davis, and their co-authors are creating. And so I, on some level, am a consumer of these data, and I'd like to believe that I'm open-minded. We've stated several hypotheses on this talk, but I'm always looking to Nick and Steve for their new data, because this is, we're all learning on the fly here. These are not laws of physics.
Any other recommendations that you would suggest based on your research on this topic that maybe we haven't touched on yet?
So come back to a theme of Emma's work, this being out of the loop. A debate that I've been having with some nerdy economists is quantity versus quality of social interaction at work. So Rob, you now have a sense that I'm a bit of an unusual person. My colleagues actually like me to only show up 2 or 3 days a week because of the quality-quantity trade-off. If I'm in good spirits when I show up, I'm a better colleague. And so I think there hasn't been enough discussion in this quantitative literature because quality of social interactions is so hard to measure. There hasn't been enough work in this field of when do we have a quality interaction. So if you have a great friend, do you really need to see this guy 365 days a year or just 4 days a year? So a similar issue in terms of productivity, learning, and mentoring. And we need much more work on that to better understand if more mothers do work from home, will this become a pink ghetto, or will it become this utopia that Matt keeps chanting about that I may get a tattoo that says that?
That would be a great tattoo. The funny thing about it in my mind is there are basic economic concepts like marginal utility that we have not wanted to apply to the idea of being in the office, because traditionally the idea was just as a corporate employee, you work from the office, right? But now that you open it up, why is it a given that 5 days a week is the maximum utility, kind of like on a marginal basis, right? In terms of thinking about being in the office. And I think that point is important. And the other piece of it in my mind is around, it's not just working mothers, right, that benefit from flexibility. I mean, I talk about this often, but I'm a I have a almost 3-year-old and almost 1-year-old, and I've derived a lot of experience, benefit, and otherwise from being home more often. And the amount of time I spend with my children and having that flexibility, and me doing that also makes it easier, and lots of me's, if you will, doing that makes it easier for women to do that too, and not
I
have a
love
differential
it.
experience.
And that speaks to the chore wars. A very important topic in economics is the household chore wars and this unfortunate current fact of women bearing more of the necessary but annoying tasks within the household. And so I love where you're going. Rob, a half joke. Many economists love this work by Nick Bloom of work from home guys playing more rounds of golf on weekdays. So we need a new paper studying how many are these minor league Tiger Woods and John Daly's versus how many are you.
It sounds like pickleball also, by the way, is becoming, it sounds like now the next like version of golf that's starting to see more of that. It's a very funny thing. So any final thoughts, Matt, that we didn't touch on related to this topic, whether it be on your research or things you're burning to say that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet?
So on my end, the only one would be, I'm envious of some of my brothers and sisters in academic economics who have the chance to work with specific firms, with their HR groups, about field experiments related to trying work from home policies. Nick Bloom, I hope and expect, will win a Nobel Prize for his early work on China and work from home. And I will celebrate that October day. Usually I'm angry. That was a half joke when the Nobel is announced and my wife and I don't get the call. But Nick was the father of this literature that's now over a decade old. But we need much more work on coming back to some of the themes you were saying, for different CEOs of their perspective on the costs and benefits to their organization, quality of life, and the zeitgeist of the firm if they introduce work from home? Or is the concern that the firm will become atomistic with no corporate culture? Could that be true? So, Rob, we didn't talk about how do you build up a good corporate culture. So at your firm, are you heading to miniature golf courses? Are there bonding experiences that I haven't been invited to?
I think we're a big believer, to your point, on fewer interactions of high quality and actually enabling social interaction and relationship development that way versus requiring people to be in the office on a regular basis. I would also note, though, that we're a small firm. And I think that the answer is different if you are 1 million employees versus 20 employees, right? I think there are differences in terms of the complexity of operations and what it means to operate cross-functionally. And so I'm also quick to note that I don't think that there's a single right answer. And part of it is figuring out what makes sense for you and then building your culture and values and operating system around that to support it the right way.
It's been great to talk.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, Matt. So maybe 2 things. One, for people who would like to learn more about you or find your research, or maybe CEOs or people at companies who would like to get their CEO to sign up to spend some time with you to talk about some studies, where would you send them to go do that?
So I want more readers. I want to double my readership of my book, Going Remote, where I expand on several of the themes we talked about. And I'd be delighted if people contact me at my USC email, which will be linked to in the podcast notes. And I would love that. Again, my mother continues to ask me, how are you actually helping the economy? I say, I'm paying my taxes and just keeping my head low. And my mother says that's not enough. And so Rob, a final question there. What have you learned from the economists? Or are we just averaging over the data points? Have we surprised you in your discussions with us?
I think that I am a very data-driven person, so I'm a bit of an easy audience for this topic. And I think one of as it relates to flexible work or remote work broadly, too often this feels like a religious argument to me, where it's not enough data, but strong feelings that are not. And I don't want to invalidate strong feelings and experience, but a lot of I grew up in this way, and therefore my belief on what it means to build a company is this way. So what I really appreciate is when data gets brought to the conversation and you look empirically and say, okay, how do I think about what's happening for a particular group or companies pre-post? And I think that body of data is ultimately what will win out over time. And so I really appreciate the role that economists play in kind of like bringing that to life. And part of our inspiration for Flex Index is to enable that type of analysis and discussion based on hard data versus I believe that this is right and therefore it is so.
I greatly respect that.
Well, Matt, I always enjoy chatting with you. I think your work is fantastic. Everyone should go read Matt's book and go check out some of the work that he's done and research on both the motherhood penalty, but also a broader set of topics that you've done. Thank you so much for spending the time with me.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please also consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that helps other listeners find the podcast. For more Flex Index content, including past episodes, our Flex Index newsletter, and monthly research reports, visit flex.scoopforwork.com. See you next time.